The smell hit me first. Ozone and wet earth, sharp and sudden like a thunderstorm that hadn't happened yet. One breath it wasn't there. The next it was everywhere. I stopped walking. The tree line ahead looked normal at first. Lodgepole pines, late afternoon shadow cutting long and flat across the snow. The kind of stillness that a forest earns in winter. But there was something wrong with the edge of it. Not wrong like a sound or a shape. Wrong like a word you've read so many times it stops looking like a word. The border between the trees and the open ground wasn't holding still. It was moving, but not the way things move when wind pushes them. It moved the way the edge of your vision moves when you turn too fast and the world hasn't caught up yet. My GPS chirped. I looked down, the boundary line on the screen. And the thin blue thread I'd been tracking for the past 2 hours had redrawn itself. It no longer ran parallel to my position. It ran through it. I was standing directly on the line. I pressed my earpiece. Halverson, the GPS just redrawn. I'm sitting on the boundary. Her voice came back flat and controlled. Don't move, Maddox. Hold your position and tell me what you see. I told her about the tree line. About the way the absence of something was cutting across it, not a shape, not a body, just a place where the light didn't quite agree with itself. It was moving. Every time I stood still, it moved closer, not fast, patient. Then static, a burst of it, hard enough to sting. And then my own voice came through the earpiece. Calm, measured, exactly the cadence I use when I'm reading back coordinates. You're already inside its path. That was 6 days into the job. I need to go back to how I ended up there. My name is Everett Cole Maddox. I spent 11 years in federal land management before I was recruited into a division that doesn't appear on any organizational chart I've ever been shown. My background was spatial analysis, boundary surveying, jurisdictional mapping for contested wilderness territories. I understood borders the way a plumber understands pipe, functionally, precisely. I knew where human definition ended and unmanaged space began, and I knew how to document that difference. That's why they wanted me. The formal offer came through Douglas Rafe Tolland, my assigned operations handler, a compact man with the careful diction of someone who had learned to say everything twice before saying it once. And he met me at a field office in Missoula on a Tuesday in early February, sliding a folder across a conference table that smelled of industrial cleaner and old coffee. He didn't call it a CRYPTID program, he called it the Boundary Tracking Unit, and he described the work as monitoring non-fixed territorial entities in federally protected wilderness zones. I said non-fixed means they move. He said non-fixed means they don't have a stable physical address. I asked what the difference was. He looked at the folder instead of at me and said, "You'll understand once you're in the field." The briefing materials described the assignment in terms I recognized. GPS-defined movement paths, territorial mapping, containment protocols. The language was familiar enough that I didn't push on the parts that weren't quite right, and the parts where the phrasing bent slightly away from what I expected, like a sentence that almost parses but doesn't. Containment through observation. Boundary maintenance via active tracking. I noted those phrases and filed them. Tolland handed me the operational rules before I left the building. He didn't read them to me. He slid them across the table on a single laminated card and waited while I read them myself. 3 rules for the initial deployment. He delivered each one as I reached it, almost like he was reciting from memory. Never cross the same boundary line twice in opposite directions, he said, his voice the same temperature it had been for the entire meeting. I looked up. Because of what happens to the line or because of what happens to me? Because of what happens to the line, he said, which affects what happens to you. I kept reading. If your GPS redraws your path, follow the new route without hesitation. He waited until I'd read that one through twice. Hesitation creates a gap. You don't want to be in the gap. The third rule felt simpler. Do not stop moving when instructed unless you can confirm your position visually. I looked up when I reached it. What does confirm visually mean in dense tree cover? Talon stood up and buttoned his jacket. That's why we pair new trackers with a field liaison, he said. Lillian Greer Halverson will meet you at the staging area. She'll fill in the gaps. I didn't know yet that filling in the gaps was exactly the wrong way to think about any of this. The Bitterroot National Forest in Ravalli County covers roughly 1.5 million acres of western Montana, and I had surveyed portions of it years before, during a jurisdictional dispute over wilderness boundary classifications, and I remembered it as cold, steep, and dense in a way that made radio communication unreliable and navigation legitimately difficult even with good equipment. In February, it was all of those things in a way that pressed down on you. The cold wasn't just temperature, it had weight. It settled into your gear and your joints and the spaces between your thoughts, and it stayed there. Lillian met me at the staging area, a converted ranger station about 40 minutes off the main road, its gravel lot bordered by a chain-link fence with federal property signs bolted at regular intervals. She was somewhere in her mid-40s with a directness that reminded me of experienced field medics, in the kind of clarity that comes from having made fast decisions in bad conditions. Enough times that patience with imprecision has completely burned away. She handed me a hot coffee without asking if I wanted one and pointed at the equipment laid out on the station's main table. "You've worked GPS boundary work before," she said. It wasn't a question. 11 years of it. "Forget half of what you know," she said. "The system here doesn't behave the way the system you know behaves." I asked her what she meant. She picked up one of the handheld GPS units and turned it so I could see the screen. There was a boundary line drawn across the display in blue, thin and precise. As I watched, it shifted. Not a recalibration, not a signal correction. It moved steadily, maybe 2 centimeters on the screen in the direction of my position. "And the maps update in real time," she said, "even when no data is being input." I stared at it for a moment. That's not how GPS works. "No," she agreed, "it isn't." She set the unit down. "Your first instinct will be to think the equipment is faulty. It isn't faulty. The map is accurate. That's the thing you have to sit with." She briefed me on the entity itself in careful, minimal language. She called it a line breaker. She described it as an entity that did not exist within stable physical coordinates, that moved along the edges of defined boundaries the way water moves along surfaces. She did not say where it came from. She did not explain how the program had identified it. She said, "You're not following it, you're staying ahead of it." And when I asked what happened if I fell behind, she said, "And you become part of the path instead of the one defining it." I didn't understand what that meant. I thought I did. I didn't. My first full deployment day, I was running a standard grid sweep along the eastern sector boundary, a section the program designated as Line 7. The morning was clear enough that I could see my breath in little clouds, and the snow underfoot had that packed, quiet quality that means nobody has walked on it in days. The silence was the kind that has texture to it, the kind that makes small sounds louder than they should be. I found the boundary marker inside of an hour. Not a physical marker, nothing planted in the ground. A perceptual one. I crossed a line that wasn't there and felt it like a pressure shift, a sudden drop in my ears exactly like the sensation of altitude change. And at the same moment, the air changed. The ozone hit me. Wet soil underneath it, cold and mineral, and something else below that I didn't have a name for. Something faint and organic that made me think of cold storage. The static in my headset spiked. I stopped walking and looked behind me. The line was visible. That surprised me. I hadn't expected visible, but there it was, a faint bending of light in the air, maybe 4 feet off the ground, running in a rough east-to-west direction through the trees. Not a shimmer exactly. More like the air on either side of it had slightly different densities, like looking through 2 panes of glass that don't quite match. I pressed my earpiece. Halverson. I'm looking at the boundary. It has a visual component. Describe it exactly, she said. No surprise in her voice. She'd seen this before, and I described it. She listened without interrupting. Don't cross back, she said when I finished. I know. Rule 1. That's not why I'm saying it, she said. I'm saying it because it's already noticed you. Crossing back collapses the boundary behind you and it moves to compensate. I held very still and watched the line. It held position. The pressure in my ears stayed constant. Then slowly it moved, maybe 10 feet, in my direction. I took a step back and it stopped. I took another step back and it held. I said, it's reactive. They always are, she said. That's why the rules exist. You're not tracking a body, you're managing an edge. The ozone smell intensified for a moment, then faded. The boundary line in my GPS had already redrawn. The new path was behind me, not in front. I followed it without hesitating, in the way Tolland had instructed. The pressure in my ears faded as I moved. I didn't stop to think about the fact that the line had moved toward me while I stood still and away from me as I retreated. I filed it in the category of things I didn't have enough information to analyze yet. That was the last time I let anything in this system go into a holding category. The next time the terrain asked me a question I couldn't answer, I was already 3 steps deeper into something I couldn't walk backwards out of. The second full day, I started noticing the terrain itself. The GPS had been rerouting me since morning. Small adjustments, nothing dramatic. But cumulatively, the path I was walking had curved me through a section of the forest I wouldn't have chosen independently. I was following it, as instructed, without hesitation. And then at some point in the early afternoon, I looked up from the screen and realized that the forest in front of me had arranged itself into something that shouldn't have been possible. The fallen trees were directional. Not at random angles the way fallen trees should be, the product of wind and weight and rot. They were pointing the same direction, not perfectly parallel, but close enough that the pattern was undeniable. The branches that had broken off and settled into the snow made lines. The rock formations I was picking my way through formed angles, all of it oriented along the same axis as the GPS path I'd been following. I stopped walking. The static in my headset cut in, sharp and brief. Halverson, I said. The terrain is matching the path. A pause. How long has it been doing it? I looked back along the way I'd come. I don't know, at least an hour. I hesitated. The formations look natural, but they're aligned. They weren't aligned this morning, she said. I ran a satellite pull on your sector at 0600. It was standard terrain. I stood in the middle of the pattern and turned slowly. The rocks, the branches, the angles, all of it precise in a way that nature isn't precise. The kind of precision that requires intention. I said, who draws the boundaries? She was quiet for a moment. Operations does the initial mapping based on historical tracking data. Historical from how far back? Another pause, longer. That's above my clearance level, Maddox. I noted that she answered the question I asked, not the question I was actually asking. At the time, I thought the distinction was administrative. I know now that it was everything. I looked at the GPS screen. As I stood still, the path on the screen moved subtly, less than a centimeter, orienting itself slightly more precisely with the angles in the terrain around me. The map was not predicting where I would walk. It was deciding. And the forest was confirming. The static spiked again as I tried to lock my position. Just for a second, the signal washed out completely. And in that second, I couldn't have told anyone with certainty exactly where I was. I marked the time. I marked the position as best I could. And I kept moving because the third rule was still in effect, and standing still while uncertain of your position wasn't something the rules allowed. Looking back, that was the last morning I was genuinely confident that the path I was walking was mine. Day 4 brought something I was not prepared for, and I say that as someone who had gone through a week of preparatory briefings. Tolland had given me the rules. Lillian had walked me through the field protocols. There was a full technical dossier on the entity's behavioral patterns, its movement corridors, its response to GPS-defined tracking. I had read all of it. I had internalized all of it. None of it prepared me for hearing my own voice in my earpiece. I was in the process of a position check, relaying my coordinates to Lillian when the transmission cut out mid-sentence. Static for 2 or 3 seconds. And then my own voice, exact timbre, exact cadence, said calmly into my ear. Mark the boulder on your left. That's your reference point. Move southwest from there, bearing 260 degrees. I stood completely still. The voice had not been a recording. It wasn't distorted. It wasn't echo. Wasn't interference. It was me. Present tense me with the faint background sound of wind that matched the wind I was currently standing in. I remembered Rule 5. Lillian had delivered it on the second morning standing outside the ranger station, holding her coffee and watching the tree line. With the particular focused calm of someone who has learned not to react visibly to things that frighten them. If you hear your own voice on comms, she'd said, ignore all instructions for 60 seconds. Don't respond to it. Don't follow it. Start a mental count and wait it out. I started counting. At 43 seconds, my actual voice came back, mid-sentence, completing the coordinate readout I'd been in the middle of when the signal dropped. Lillian confirmed she had received my original transmission, and she had heard nothing between the cutout and the reconnect. The instructions it gave me, I said, boulder on my left southwest bearing 260. Don't follow them, she said immediately. I know. But Halverson, they were correct. I can see the boulder. That bearing would have routed me around the eastern approach and back onto the main path without crossing any boundary. A silence, longer than the last one. It's learning how you move, she said. It's modeling your decision-making well enough to replicate it. How long has it been doing that? Hard to say. It gets better each day you're in the field. I sat with that for a while. The thought that something had been watching me move, watching me choose, accumulating a picture of how I calculated direction and distance and risk, precise enough to pass as my own voice in my own ear. I have worked with monitoring systems and tracking software for over a decade. I understand surveillance as a technical problem. What I was describing was not a technical problem. What I was describing was something paying very close attention to me in the way a person pays attention to another person they intend to understand. That was the moment the fear stopped being abstract. Not panic, not shock. Something colder and more durable than either of those things. The recognition that I was being studied in a way that implied a purpose I hadn't been briefed on. I asked Lillian, if it can model my decisions accurately enough to predict them, what happens when the predictions become indistinguishable from the original instructions? She said, that's why Rule 5 exists. That wasn't actually an answer to my question, and we both knew it. The terrain that afternoon had a quality I couldn't name at the time. There was a particular precision to the way the forest met me as I walked through it. Small things. A gap in the undergrowth that opened exactly wide enough for me to pass through without adjusting my direction. A rise in the ground that matched my stride length so exactly that I didn't notice it as a change in elevation. The path the GPS was drawing was no longer rerouting me in response to conditions. The conditions were restructuring themselves in response to the path. The map wasn't predictive, it wasn't generative, it was a conversation and something else was talking. I had known Bryce Nolan Kettering's name for 3 days before I found him in the field. Tolland had mentioned him in passing during the initial briefing, describing him as a senior tracker with more active deployment hours than anyone else in the program. He was officially listed as missing in a field incident 8 weeks prior. Tolland had said incident with the particular neutrality of a word that is functioning as a wall rather than a description. I came across Kettering on the morning of Day 5, standing inside a section of visible boundary line about a quarter mile into the restricted zone. He was standing still, which was the first wrong thing. Nobody stands still inside a visible boundary. The rules are very clear about movement. But he was standing as calmly as if he were waiting for a bus, hands loose at his sides. No equipment bag, headset sitting around his neck rather than on his ears. And he was in his early 60s, lean and deliberate in the way of someone who had spent decades in field work. And when he looked at me as I approached, his expression carried a recognition that made me feel, briefly and uncomfortably, that he had expected me specifically. "Maddox," he said. Not a question. "Kettering." I stopped a few feet outside the boundary line. I could feel the pressure differential in my ears, the ozone just at the edge of detectable. "Operations listed you as a field casualty." "Operations listed me as a field casualty because I stopped reporting in," he said. "Not the same thing." He looked at the boundary line with what I can only describe as affection. "You're further along than I expected at this stage. Most trackers are still trying to reconcile the GPS behavior at Day 5. How long have you been inside the boundary?" He considered that. 6 weeks on and off. Mostly on." "Kettering, that's against every protocol in the protocols exist to manage your relationship to the line," he said, not unkindly. "They don't exist because the line is dangerous. They exist because you're dangerous to it." He paused. "Or were, before you understood." I asked him to explain what he understood. He turned to look at me fully, and his voice had the patient cadence of someone delivering a lecture they've been shaping for a very long time. "The line breakers require defined paths to exist. They don't create borders, they inhabit them. Every boundary line we draw, every GPS path we run, in every rule we follow that enforces a definition of here versus there, gives them something to organize around." He paused. "The tracking protocols don't constrain them, they feed them." "Then the solution is to stop tracking," I said. "Is it?" He smiled slightly. "Stop tracking and the lines become formless. The entity becomes formless. Formless doesn't mean gone. It means present everywhere at once with no defined edge, no observable pattern, no response to movement." He turned back to the boundary. "I'd argue that's worse." "Then what do we do?" "We remain," he said. "The boundary is stable when a person who understands it occupies it. My presence gives it shape. That shape is containable." He said it the way you say something you've verified from all angles and found to be simply true. I know it seems like a kind of surrender. It isn't. It's a permanent assignment. I looked at him inside that shimmering line, the forest on either side perfectly still, the air around his position carrying that faint electrical quality that I now associated with the creature's proximity. His feet were planted at the precise center of the boundary. He wasn't standing in it. He was standing on it. "You're the definition," I said. Understanding it as I said it, he said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. I left him there and made it back to the staging area before Lillian's check-in window. I told her what I'd found. She was quiet for a long time, and in that quiet I heard the sound of someone carefully deciding how much of what they already knew to confirm. "He's been inside boundaries before," she said finally, "and Tolland knows about it." Tolland classified him as a casualty. Tolland, she said, classified him as a resource at a different stage of deployment. That was the sentence that opened the first crack in everything I'd been told about what the program actually was. On the morning of Day 6, the expansion event happened, and I still don't have language precise enough to describe what I was watching. I was on an elevated observation point, a rock shelf about 90 feet above the valley floor, running a visual sweep of the sector while Lillian coordinated a satellite pull. The sky was flat white, overcast, the kind of cloud cover that flattens distance and makes it hard to judge how far anything is. The valley below me was a standard winter forest, dense, still, nothing moving. Then the lines appeared, and not the subtle shimmer I'd learned to read as a close-range boundary. These were large-scale. The entire valley floor began to resolve into geometry. The tree lines realigned, the natural curves of the terrain, the irregular organic shapes that forests make when left alone, straightened. Not completely, not like something mechanical, but enough that the pattern was visible from 90 feet up. The valley was drawing itself into sections, clean angular divisions, like property boundaries on a cadastral map but covering square miles of wilderness. My GPS showed path lines accumulating, not my current path. Previous mission paths, days and weeks old, overlaying on top of each other in a dense web of blue lines that covered the entire sector and extended outward to the edge of the screen. I said, "Halverson, and the system is showing all previous tracking paths simultaneously." Her voice was careful. "What does the coverage look like?" "Like a map of every path every tracker has ever run in this sector. They're all overlapping. Halverson, they form a continuous network. There are no gaps." A long silence. "Who drew the first line?" I asked. I don't know why I said it out loud. It wasn't a question she could answer. Maybe that's why I said it. Some questions need to be spoken before their weight becomes real. She didn't respond. Down in the valley, the geometry held for 40 seconds. I counted. Then the trees returned to their ordinary irregular shapes. The lines faded and the GPS cleared back to my current path only, like a window that had briefly opened. But I'd seen it, the full architecture of what the program had been building, not for weeks, but for years, possibly decades. The tracking paths every line ever run, every boundary ever followed, had accumulated into a territory. A defined, bounded, mapped territory covering not just this sector, but, I understood suddenly with a certainty I couldn't support but couldn't dismiss, far more than this sector. The creature whose movement we were managing wasn't a single entity moving through a defined space. The defined space was the creature. Every surveyed line, every tracked boundary, every GPS path ever followed by every field tracker who had ever been deployed by this program had been drawing a body for something that had no form of its own, and it had been growing. Following the mapped edges of human definition outward across a continent, expanding wherever someone drew a line and confirmed it, because confirmation was the same as existence. The program had not been managing the line breakers. The program had been building them. I stood on that rock shelf in the flat February cold with the ozone smell rising from the valley below me and the pressure building in my ears. And I thought about Bryce Kettering standing inside his boundary line with his calm certainty and his planted feet, serving as a permanent definition of an edge that would not hold shape without a human to believe in it. And I thought about what Lillian had called me. Ahead of it, not following it, ahead of it. Because something following you doesn't need to learn your voice. The breaking point came on day 7, and I want to be honest about what drove it because it wasn't courage and it wasn't wisdom, and it was the specific fear of a very particular kind of competent person who has just realized that the expertise they've been applying has been doing the opposite of what they believed. I spent 11 years making boundaries real. drawing lines on maps and confirming them in the field, deciding where one thing ended and another began. The program had recruited me precisely for that skill, told me it was the skill needed to manage a territorial entity, and it was only on day 7 that I understood those two sentences meant the same thing. I stopped following the GPS. I didn't consult the map. I didn't follow a bearing. I moved without pattern, changing direction at irregular intervals, crossing my own path at angles the system hadn't prepared for. The environment responded immediately, and the fallen branches and rock formations that had been aligning with my movement began to shift back, losing their geometry, returning to irregular natural configurations. The boundary line that had been staying within a consistent distance ahead of me began to flicker. I could feel it in the air, the electrical static becoming choppy, the pressure in my ears varying instead of holding steady. For a few minutes I thought it was working. Then the distortion closed, not gradually. In a hard, fast surge, the boundary came toward me from 3 directions simultaneously, tightening the space around me until the ozone was thick enough to taste, metallic and sharp, and the static in my headset was continuous white noise that I couldn't talk through. The terrain around me had stopped aligning, but only because it didn't need to align anymore. I wasn't walking a path. I was standing at the center of a collapsing perimeter. I understood then what Kettering had been telling me, stripped of his careful framing. Unpredictability disrupted the structure, yes. But the structure wasn't what kept the distortion at a safe distance. The structure was what kept the distortion intelligible, predictable, manageable. Without it, the thing wasn't gone. It was simply no longer following rules. There was no safe approach. That understanding had a particular quality that I want to name precisely because it's different from panic and different from despair. It was the clarity of a professional who has worked through all the available options and confirmed that none of them are good. I felt it once before, years ago, caught on a wrong side of a wildfire line during a survey that went sideways. And the feeling isn't hopelessness, it's arithmetic. This option costs this much. That option costs this much. Neither option returns you to where you were before the problem started. Which cost can you carry? I pressed my earpiece through the static. Lillian's voice was barely audible. "Get out of the sector," she said. "Don't define a path, don't follow a route. Move toward the staging area without recording your direction. My GPS will record it automatically." "Turn it off." I stared at the unit in my hand. 11 years of the discipline that keeps a field surveyor functional is the discipline of never going off-grid. You keep the GPS live. You maintain your position record. You don't move through restricted terrain without a traceable path. Those rules existed for very good reasons. I turned the GPS off. The distortion didn't retreat, but it stopped advancing. I moved. Here is what I now know, assembled from everything I observed over those 7 days and everything I have been able to piece together from the materials I reviewed before I walked away from the program entirely. The line breakers are not creatures in the way I used to understand that word. They have no body in stable space. They have no independent territory. No home range, no den, no marked zone of origin. They exist as processes, the physical manifestation of defined edges between mapped spaces. Wherever a human authority has drawn a meaningful line, a property boundary, a jurisdictional limit, a surveyed wilderness perimeter, a GPS tracking path run by a program specifically designed to confirm their existence, the conditions for a line breaker exist. They don't arrive. They form, and they form wherever the act of definition is performed carefully enough and confirmed consistently enough to give an edge a kind of weight. The government program had been doing exactly that, systematically, for decades longer than I was told. Every tracking mission was a confirmation event. Every GPS path was a new segment of defined boundary. Every rule followed precisely created a clearly defined behavioral corridor that the entity could organize around. The program had been framed internally as observation, as containment, as management. But what it actually was, structurally and functionally, was construction. The program built line breakers the way you build a wall, one confirmed line at a time, over years and decades until the wall covered territory that no single tracker could comprehend from their position inside it. Eden and I had to look back at everything I'd observed and understand it in that light. The GPS redrawing its path through my position on day 6 of the job wasn't a malfunction. It was accurate. I was already on the line because the line formed wherever I walked, because I was a trained boundary professional who confirmed edges by moving along them. The terrain aligning with the GPS paths wasn't the environment responding to the creature. It was the environment responding to me, to the act of definition I carried with me the way a carpenter carries a level. The boundary I crossed in my first deployment that produced the pressure shift and the ozone smell that hadn't been waiting for me. It had organized itself out of the mapped historical paths that previous trackers had run through the same section of forest. Kettering understood this. Kettering had arrived at the same understanding I was reaching and had made the opposite choice. He'd decided that if definition gave the entity form, then his own stable presence in a defined space was the most honest response available to him. He wasn't captured, he wasn't converted, he was a man who understood the mechanics of something precisely enough to choose to be useful to it in a way that felt to him like integrity. His certainty wasn't madness, it was the result of someone following a logical argument all the way to its conclusion. What I couldn't accept was the same conclusion, because there is a difference between being useful to a process and being willing to be a component of it. Kettering was standing inside the boundary with his feet planted and his eyes open, and his identity serving as an anchor for something that had no anchor of its own. He had become part of the system's stability. He believed that was stewardship. I saw him clearly there on that last morning when I was moving back through his sector toward the staging area, moving without GPS, without a defined path, trying to reduce the definitional weight of every step I took. He was still inside the boundary line. The distortion was stable around him, holding shape the way a soap bubble holds shape, taut and precise and dependent on the perfect balance of internal and external pressure. His face was turned toward me as I passed, and he smiled that slight smile again, the confirmation smile, the smile of someone watching the world verify something they already knew. He did not call out to me. He did not try to stop me. He watched me make my choice the same way he had made his, with the calm of someone who has decided that other people's choices are not his responsibility. I kept moving. I reached the staging area in the early afternoon. Lillian was waiting outside. She had a go bag at her feet and she was holding 2 coffees, which I understood to mean she had been listening to my progress through the sector and had timed the coffee to my arrival. That kind of operational precision was something I had admired about her from the start and admired even now. Standing at the edge of 7 days that had dismantled almost everything I thought I understood about the work I did. I took the coffee. I stood next to her and we both looked at the tree line. "Tolland will want a debrief," she said. "Tolland can wait. He'll ask if you're continuing the deployment." "I'm not continuing the deployment." She nodded, the nod of someone who had anticipated the answer and filed it. "He'll tell you the program needs active trackers. That without continuous confirmation the network degrades." "I know." I drank the coffee. It was hot and it tasted like the most ordinary thing I had encountered in a week. "I'm not continuing the deployment." We stood there for a while longer. The tree line held still. The air was clean of ozone, clean of static, cold and sharp, and holding nothing except February and altitude. Lillian said quietly, "The question you asked on the observation point. Who drew the first line? I thought about it after you asked." And she looked into her coffee cup. "I think the answer is that it doesn't matter. And whatever drew the first line, the program was drawing lines long before it understood what it was drawing. That's not a defense. It's just the history." I thought about a history of careful, precise field workers with good equipment and excellent training. All of them doing their jobs correctly, all of them adding their paths to a network they couldn't see from their individual positions. All of them contributing one confirmed boundary at a time to something whose total architecture would have terrified them if they could have stood high enough to see it all at once. I drove out of the Bitterroot that afternoon. The road south through Ravalli County is long and flat where it runs between the mountains, and then by the time I reached the highway, the forest had been behind me for an hour, and the sky had opened up into the wide, pale expanse that Montana gives you when the terrain finally lets go. I had my GPS off. I was navigating by road signs, the way people drove for most of human history, before someone decided that defining your precise position at every moment was a form of safety. I have been out of the program for 4 months now. Talon's calls come on a regular schedule and I do not answer them. Lillian sends periodic messages, factual, clipped, telling me things I might need to know. I read them. I don't always respond. I've gone back to ordinary work, consulting on jurisdictional surveys, land use disputes, the kind of work that involves drawing lines and confirming them. I do it carefully the way I always have, and because precision is how I'm built, and precision doesn't leave you just because you've learned something about what it costs. But I check things now that I didn't used to check. I notice the edges of defined spaces in a way that other people don't, or don't yet. The straight ruled precision of property lines where they cross irregular terrain, the way a GPS path will insist on a route that follows a surveyed boundary even when a more direct route exists. The slight resistance in the air when you cross from one jurisdictional zone into another if you're paying attention, if you've trained yourself to feel it. I drove past a highway survey crew last week. 3 workers with stakes and transit equipment, running a boundary reassessment along a corridor where the road had been rerouted. Standard work, I've done it myself, but I watched them for a moment from the car, watching them plant stakes and confirm positions and add their measurements to a system that records where the lines are. I kept driving. I don't know whether leaving the forest was the end of it. That's the thing I carry, the question I can't close because it doesn't have an answer I can access from where I'm standing. Kettering believed the entity formed around definition and dissolved without it. He believed his presence stabilized it. He might be right. But if he's right, then the inverse is also possible. If definition gives a line-breaker form, then a person who defines spaces professionally, compulsively by training and by instinct, doesn't stop defining them by leaving one forest. They carry the tendency with them. They run it wherever they work, every survey, every GPS path, into every confirmed boundary. My GPS redraws its path sometimes when I'm in unfamiliar terrain, just briefly. A slight correction that puts me on a line I didn't choose. I follow it because the rule is still in me even though the program isn't, and because not following it has consequences I now understand. And every morning before I pick up the transit equipment and go out to mark the edges of the next piece of disputed ground, I stand at the door and I feel for it. The faint electrical pressure in the air. The ozone just at the edge of detectable. The subtle drop in my ears that means a line is somewhere near. Most mornings there's nothing. Most mornings